The sun filtered through the blinds, painting golden streaks across the kitchen floor as I poured my second cup of coffee. The smell of eggs and bacon filled the air, and the faint sound of Caleb's laughter drifted in from the living room. It was one of those mornings that made me feel grateful for this house, this life, this family we'd built together. Emma was at the stove, humming softly as she flipped the bacon. Her hair was pulled into a messy bun, and she wore the faded t-shirt I'd bought her from a concert we'd gone to years ago. It was moments like this that reminded me why I married her. Her ease, her warmth, the way she made every space feel like home. "Do you want toast with this?" she asked, glancing over her shoulder. "Sure," I replied, leaning against the counter. "Need any help?" She shook her head, smiling. "Nope, I've got it." In the living room, Caleb was sprawled on the couch, his lanky frame barely fitting as he played video games. At 16, he had the kind of energy that could fill a room, his jokes and endless questions keeping us on our toes. He looked so much like Emma, her sharp cheekbones, her dark eyes, that I often joked he was her twin. But there were pieces of me in him too, or so I'd always believed. "Dad, check this out," Caleb called, holding up his phone. "I finally beat that boss level." "Nice," I said, walking over to ruffle his hair. He groaned and swatted my hand away, but the grin on his face told me he didn't mind. Life wasn't perfect, whose was? But it was ours. And as I sat down at the table, Emma sliding a plate in front of me with a playful kiss on the cheek, I thought, this is what happiness looks like. Later that afternoon, I went to the garage to grab some tools for a leaky faucet in the bathroom. As I searched through the cluttered shelves, a small cardboard box caught my eye. It was one of Emma's, labeled old papers, in her neat handwriting. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice about it, but curiosity got the better of me. I lifted the lid, expecting to find old bills or school papers, but instead, I saw a stack of documents neatly tied together with a ribbon. On top was an envelope, its flap slightly open. The words paternity results stared back at me, bold and clinical. My stomach dropped. I stood frozen for a moment, the air in the garage suddenly thick and heavy. My hands shook as I pulled the envelope free and slid out the single sheet of paper inside. The words swam before my eyes, but one line jumped out at me. Probability of paternity, 0%. A wave of nausea hit me, and I gripped the edge of the shelf to steady myself. This had to be a mistake, a cruel joke. But the date on the document was unmistakable. It was from years ago, when Caleb was just a baby. The son I had raised, the boy who called me Dad, wasn't mine. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at that piece of paper. Minutes? Hours? The world felt like it had tilted on its axis, leaving me struggling to find my footing. My mind raced with questions, each one more painful than the last. How could this be true? Who else knew? And why the hell didn't Emma tell me? The sound of the back door opening jolted me from my thoughts. Emma's voice floated through the air, cheerful and unaware. "Chris? You out here?" I shoved the envelope back into the box and replaced the lid, my heart pounding. "Yeah," I called, my voice hoarse. "Just looking for some tools." She appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Need help?" "No," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "I've got it." She smiled back, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. "Okay, don't forget we have dinner at Laura's tonight." "Right," I said, nodding. "I'll be ready." As she walked back inside, I stared after her, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. I needed answers. I needed to know the truth, but I also needed time to figure out what the hell I was going to do. That night at Laura's, I felt like a man on autopilot. I smiled when I was supposed to, laughed at my brother-in-law's bad jokes, and nodded along to the conversation. But inside, I was unraveling. Emma sat beside me, her hand resting lightly on my knee, and I felt like a stranger was touching me. On the drive home, Caleb was animated in the back seat, talking about a project he was working on for school. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. His face lit up with excitement, and my chest tightened. He was my son. I had been there for every scraped knee, every bad report card, every soccer game. And yet, the piece of paper in that box said otherwise. When we got home, Caleb went straight to his room, and Emma disappeared into the bathroom. I stood in the hallway, the weight of the secret pressing down on me like a physical force. My gaze drifted to the garage door, the box of papers calling to me like a siren's song. I needed to know more. I needed to understand why Emma had kept this from me. The box was still where I'd left it, the envelope sitting innocently on top. I pulled out the rest of the documents, my hands trembling as I sorted through them. There were old letters, medical records, and finally, a photograph of Emma with a man I didn't recognize. He was handsome, with dark hair and a confident smile, his arms slung casually around her shoulders. The date on the back of the photo was from the year Caleb was born. I stared at the picture, my mind spinning. Was this him? The man in the photograph, was he Caleb's father? And if so, how long had Emma been hiding this from me? The sound of footsteps behind me made me whip around. Emma stood in the doorway, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. The box, the papers, the photograph in my hand. "Chris," she said, her voice trembling. "What are you doing?" "I could ask you the same thing," I said coldly, holding up the photograph. "Who is he?" She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. And in that moment, I knew. I didn't need her to say it. The truth was written all over her face. Emma's face turned ashen as she stared at the photograph in my hand. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. It was as if she were frozen, unable, or unwilling, to bridge the silence that had settled between us. "Who is he?" I repeated, my voice cold and steady, though inside, my heart pounded like a war drum. Her gaze dropped to the floor, her hands wringing nervously in front of her. "Chris," she began, her voice barely audible, "it's not what you think." I let out a bitter laugh, the sound harsh and hollow. "Not what I think." "Then tell me, Emma, what am I supposed to think when I find a paternity test hidden in the garage? When I find a picture of you with him?" Tears welled in her eyes, and she took a shaky step toward me. "Please let me explain." "Then explain," I snapped, my patience worn thin. "Because right now, I'm standing here questioning everything I thought I knew about our marriage, about Caleb, about you." She inhaled sharply, wiping at her eyes with trembling fingers. "His name is Michael," she said quietly. We were together before you and I met. It was a long time ago." "Clearly not long enough," I said, holding up the photograph. "This was taken the year Caleb was born, Emma. Were you seeing him while we were together?" She hesitated, and the pause felt like a knife twisting in my chest. "It was complicated," she said finally. "When we first started dating, I wasn't sure where things were going with us. Michael and I, there were unresolved feelings and what?" I interrupted, my voice rising. "You slept with him? You got pregnant and didn't think to tell me?" "I didn't know, Chris," she cried, her voice breaking. "I didn't know who the father was. And by the time I found out, you and I were already building a life together. I didn't want to ruin that." Her words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I stared at her, my mind struggling to reconcile the woman I'd loved for nearly 2 decades with the stranger standing before me. "So you decided to lie," I said bitterly, "to keep this massive secret from me for all these years and hope I'd never find out?" "It wasn't like that," she said, her voice pleading. "I wanted to protect you, to protect us. And Caleb, he's your son, Chris. You're the one who raised him, who's been there for him every step of the way. You're his father in every way that matters." "But not biologically," I said, my voice cold. "And you made that choice for me. You took away my right to know the truth." Emma sank into a chair, her head in her hands. "I was scared," she whispered. "I was scared that if I told you you'd leave, that you'd see Caleb differently. I didn't want to risk losing everything we'd built." "And what about now?" I asked, my anger simmering just below the surface. "What were you planning to do if I never found that envelope? Just carry on pretending like everything was fine?" She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. "I didn't want you to find out like this," she said softly. "I never wanted to hurt you." "Well, congratulations," I said bitterly. "You've done an excellent job of that." The rest of the night passed in a blur. Emma retreated to the bedroom, leaving me alone in the living room with my thoughts. The photograph and paternity test sat on the coffee table, mocking me with their existence. I stared at them, my mind racing with questions I didn't have the answers to. Who was Michael? Did he even know about Caleb? And what the hell was I supposed to do with this information? The house, once a place of comfort, now felt alien to me. Every corner, every photograph on the wall, every piece of furniture seemed to scream betrayal. I wanted to leave, to escape the suffocating weight of what I'd learned. But where would I go? What would I tell Caleb? The questions kept piling up, leaving me paralyzed. The next morning, I woke up on the couch, my neck stiff and my head pounding. Emma's voice floated in from the kitchen, soft and careful as she spoke to Caleb. Just give your dad some space, okay? He's been stressed with work. I clenched my fists, anger bubbling up again. She could lie to him so easily, spinning a story to cover her tracks while I was left grappling with the truth. It was infuriating. When Caleb left for school, I confronted her again. She was washing dishes, her back to me, but I could see the tension in her shoulders as I entered the room. Does he know? I asked bluntly. Emma froze, her hands gripping the edge of the sink. What? Michael, I said. Does he know about Caleb? She turned slowly, her face pale. No, she admitted. I never told him. He's been out of my life for years, Chris. I haven't spoken to him since before Caleb was born. I shook my head, disbelief washing over me. So he doesn't even know he has a son? No, she said quietly, and I don't think he needs to. Caleb has you. You're the only father he's ever known. Her words should have comforted me, but they didn't. All I could think about was the betrayal, the lies that had formed the foundation of our family. I couldn't focus on Caleb or what this revelation meant for him. Not yet. I was too consumed by my own pain. I need time, I said finally, my voice hollow. I need space to figure out what the hell I'm supposed to do with all of this. Emma nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. I understand, she said softly. Take whatever time you need. Just, please, don't give up on us. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I grabbed my keys and left the house, the walls feeling too small, too suffocating. As I drove aimlessly through the streets, I couldn't help but wonder if there was any way back from this, or if the damage was too great to repair. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions, each more exhausting than the last. I'd always prided myself on being level-headed, the kind of man who could handle adversity without losing his footing. But this was different. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the paternity test. Every time I looked at Caleb, I felt an ache in my chest, a mixture of love and betrayal twisting inside me. Emma tried to talk to me, her words soft and pleading, but I wasn't ready. I couldn't even look at her without feeling the weight of her deceit. So I did the only thing I could. I buried myself in finding the truth. I started with the photograph. Michael, a name that had suddenly become synonymous with everything wrong in my life. He was a stranger to me, but I couldn't shake the image of him with his arm around Emma, smiling as if he belonged in that moment. Who was he? What kind of man leaves behind a child without ever knowing they existed? The photo was old, but the details were clear enough to give me a starting point. A quick internet search led me to his name in a local alumni database. He and Emma had attended the same university, graduating the same year. From there, I found a trail, an old LinkedIn profile, a few mentions in alumni newsletters, and, finally, his current job, a financial consultant in a neighboring city. The revelation left me reeling. Michael wasn't some long-lost memory or distant figure from Emma's past. He was nearby, living his life completely unaware, or so Emma claimed. A part of me wanted to march into his office, demand answers, and force him to confront the consequences of his actions. But another part of me hesitated. What if he didn't know? What if this wasn't just about Emma's betrayal, but also about a man being blindsided by a truth he'd never been given the chance to face? I spent hours debating my next move, torn between anger and the faint hope that confronting Michael might give me some clarity. In the end, I decided I couldn't move forward without answers. The drive to Michael's office felt surreal. My knuckles were white against the steering wheel, my mind racing with every possible scenario. What if he denied everything? What if he already knew and had chosen to stay silent? The possibilities were endless, each one more infuriating than the last. His office was in a sleek, modern building in the heart of the city. I parked across the street, staring at the entrance as if it might swallow me whole. My heart pounded as I stepped inside, the receptionist greeting me with a polite smile. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked. "No," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "I just need to speak with Michael Harrison. It's personal." She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "I'll check if he's available." One moment. When Michael emerged from the hallway, I almost didn't recognize him. Time had added lines to his face, and his hair was flecked with gray, but there was no mistaking the man from the photograph. His smile was polite but cautious as he approached me. "Chris, is it?" he asked, extending a hand. I shook it, my grip firm. "Yes. I need to talk to you. It's about Emma." His brow furrowed slightly, but he gestured toward a small conference room. "Let's step in here." The room was quiet, the glass walls offering a view of the bustling office beyond. Michael sat across from me, his posture relaxed but curious. "So," he said, folding his hands on the table, "what's this about?" I didn't mince words. "It's about Caleb," I said, watching his expression carefully. For a moment, he looked confused, his head tilting slightly. "Caleb?" "My son," I clarified. "Or, as it turns out, maybe not my son." His face paled, the weight of my words sinking in. "I don't understand," he said slowly. "What does this have to do with me?" I pulled the photograph from my pocket, sliding it across the table. "This was taken the year Caleb was born. Emma says you were together before she and I got serious. She claims you don't know about him." He stared at the photograph, his jaw tightening. "I haven't seen Emma in years," he said quietly. "Not since college. We ended things before graduation. Are you saying he's my son?" The raw emotion in his voice caught me off guard. It wasn't the reaction of a man who had knowingly abandoned a child. He looked genuinely shocked, his eyes darting between me and the photograph as if trying to piece together a puzzle that had been hidden from him. "That's what I'm trying to figure out," I said, my voice tinged with frustration. "She kept this from both of us. And now, I'm left trying to pick up the pieces." Michael leaned back in his chair, his expression distant. "If what you're saying is true, I don't even know where to start. Why wouldn't she tell me?" "Maybe for the same reason she didn't tell me," I said bitterly. "She thought she was protecting us. Or maybe she was just protecting herself." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of the situation hung heavy in the air, the reality of what Emma had done sinking in for both of us. "What do you want from me?" Michael asked finally. "Answers," I said, "and the truth. I'm going to need another test to confirm this, and if Caleb really is your son, you're going to have to figure out what role you want to play in his life. But I'm warning you now, if you think you can just waltz in and take over, you're wrong. I've been his father for 16 years. That doesn't change." Michael nodded slowly, his expression somber. "I understand. I don't want to make this any harder than it already is." "Good," I said, standing, "because this isn't about you or me. It's about Caleb, and he deserves better than the mess Emma dragged us into." As I walked out of the building, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Michael's reaction had been genuine, his shock unmistakable. But the road ahead was still uncertain, and the answers I sought would only lead to more questions. When I got back to the car, I sat for a long time, staring at the photograph one last time before tucking it away. No matter what the test revealed, one thing was certain: life as I knew it was over, and the pieces of it that remained would never fit together the same way again. By the time I got home, it was dark, and the house was unnervingly quiet. Emma's car was in the driveway, but there were no lights on inside, save for the faint glow coming from Caleb's room. I sat in the car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, bracing myself for what I knew was coming. When I finally stepped inside, Emma was sitting on the couch, her knees drawn up to her chest. Her face was illuminated by the flickering light of the TV, though she wasn't watching it. She looked up as I entered, her eyes wide and uncertain. "Chris," she said softly, "where have you been?" I closed the door behind me, letting the silence hang between us for a moment. "I went to see him," I said finally, my voice flat. Her breath hitched, and she sat up straighter. Him? She repeated, though the tremor in her voice told me she already knew the answer. Michael, I said, dropping my keys on the counter. I wanted to hear his side of the story. I wanted to know if he knew about Caleb. Her face drained of color, and she covered her mouth with her hand. You went to see him, she whispered. Why? Why? I echoed, incredulous. Because you've been lying to me for 16 years, Emma. Because I found out our entire marriage was built on a foundation of lies. What did you expect me to do? Just sit here and wait for you to tell me the truth? Tears filled her eyes, and she shook her head. I was going to tell you, Chris. I swear. I didn't know how. I didn't know how to fix this. Fix this? I snapped, my voice rising. You think this is something you can just fix? You've been keeping this from me for years, Emma. Years. And you didn't just lie to me. You lied to Caleb. You took away his right to know who he really is. I was trying to protect him, she said, her voice trembling. I was trying to protect all of us. Protect us from what? I demanded. The truth? Do you have any idea what this has done to me? To us? How can I ever trust you again, Emma? How can I believe anything you say? She stood, crossing the room to grab my hand, but I pulled away. Chris, she said, her voice breaking. I love you. I love our family. I know I made a mistake, a terrible, horrible mistake, but I need you to believe me when I say that I never meant to hurt you. Her words only fueled my anger. Never meant to hurt me? I repeated, my voice cold. How can you even say that? Every choice you made, every lie you told, was a conscious decision to betray me. And for what? To keep up appearances? To avoid the consequences of your actions? She sank back onto the couch, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed into her hands. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Michael didn't know, I said finally, my tone hard. He had no idea about Caleb. You didn't just lie to me. You lied to him too. And now I have to clean up the mess you made? Her head snapped up, and she stared at me with tear-streaked cheeks. What do you mean? I mean I'm getting another test, I said. I need to know for sure. And if Caleb really is Michael's son, he deserves to know the truth. We owe him that much. Chris, please, she begged, her voice desperate. Don't do this. Don't drag Caleb into this. He doesn't need to know. He doesn't need to get hurt. I shook my head, my jaw tightening. He's already hurt, Emma. He just doesn't know it yet. The next morning, I sat Caleb down in the living room. Emma hovered in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. Caleb looked between us, his brow furrowed with confusion. What's going on? He asked, his voice wary. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart. Caleb, I said gently, there's something we need to talk about. Something complicated. He crossed his arms, leaning back against the couch. Okay, what is it? It's about your mom and me, I said carefully. About our family. And about you. His expression shifted, a flicker of fear crossing his face. What do you mean? I found something recently, I continued, my voice heavy. Something that makes me think. I may not be your biological father. For a moment, Caleb just stared at me, his mouth slightly open. Then he laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound. What? That's crazy. You're my dad. Of course you are. I've always been your dad, I said firmly, and that will never change. But biologically, we need to confirm some things. Confirm what? He said, his voice rising. You're my dad. You've always been my dad. Why does this even matter? Emma stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Caleb, she said softly, your dad is right. We need to be honest with you. There's a possibility that someone else might be your biological father. Caleb's face crumpled, and he shook his head. No, he said, his voice trembling. That's not true. You're lying. Caleb, I know this is a lot to take in, I said, my chest tightening at the sight of his tears. But I need you to know that none of this changes how much I love you. You're my son, no matter what. He stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger. Why are you doing this? he shouted. Why are you ruining everything? Before I could respond, he stormed out of the room, slamming the door to his bedroom behind him. The sound echoed through the house, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Emma sank onto the couch, her hands covering her face as she sobbed. I sat down beside her, my head in my hands, the weight of the moment pressing down on me like a physical force. I told you this would hurt him, she said through her tears. And I told you the truth needed to come out, I replied, my voice hollow. No matter how much it hurts. The house felt like a tomb in the days that followed. Caleb barely left his room, emerging only to grab meals before retreating back behind the closed door. Emma hovered around him, her eyes rimmed red from crying, but he refused to speak to her. I couldn't blame him. He was grappling with a truth he wasn't ready for, one that had blindsided him as much as it had me. I stayed in the guest room, unable to share a bed with Emma. The distance between us was both physical and emotional, a chasm neither of us knew how to cross. She tried, though. Every night, she would knock on the door, asking if we could talk. And every night, I told her I wasn't ready. The DNA test results arrived a week later. I opened the envelope with trembling hands, my heart pounding in my chest. Emma sat across from me at the dining table, her face pale and drawn. Caleb was upstairs, his door closed as usual. The silence in the house was deafening. The results were clear. Michael was Caleb's biological father. The words stared back at me, stark and undeniable. I set the paper down, exhaling a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Emma reached for it, her hands shaking as she read the confirmation for herself. I'm sorry, she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. I'm so sorry. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. That evening, I sat Caleb down in the living room. He looked at me warily, his arms crossed over his chest. Emma stood in the doorway, watching us with a mixture of fear and sadness. I got the results back, I said, my voice steady but heavy. And it's true. I'm not your biological father. Caleb's jaw tightened, and he looked away, blinking rapidly. So that's it then, he said bitterly. We're not even really family? No, I said firmly, leaning forward. That's not what this means. Biology doesn't define family, Caleb. I've been your dad since the day you were born, and that hasn't changed. It never will. He looked at me, his eyes filled with anger and hurt. You don't get it. Everything I thought I knew is a lie. Everything. I understand how you feel, I said softly, but you need to know that this doesn't change how much I love you. It doesn't change how proud I am of you. You're my son, Caleb. Always. For a moment, he didn't respond. Then he stood abruptly, his fists clenched at his sides. I need to get out of here, he muttered, brushing past me. Caleb, Emma started, but he was already out the door, slamming it shut behind him. The sound echoed through the house, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Emma collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. This is all my fault, she sobbed. I've ruined everything. I stood there, watching her break down, feeling a mixture of anger and pity. You made choices, Emma, I said, my voice cold. Choices that hurt all of us. And now we're the ones paying for them. Over the next few weeks, the house remained tense and fractured. Caleb stayed out late, coming home long after curfew and barely acknowledging either of us. Emma and I spoke only when necessary, our conversations strained and brief. It was as if the life we'd built together had been hollowed out, leaving only a fragile shell behind. Mark, my brother, came by one evening to check on me. We sat on the back porch, the cool night air a welcome contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside. You look like hell, he said, handing me a beer. Feel like it too, I muttered, taking a long sip. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. Have you figured out what you're going to do? I shook my head. I don't even know where to start, Mark. Every time I look at Emma, I see the lies. And Caleb, he's hurting. I don't know how to fix this. Maybe you don't have to fix it, Mark said. Maybe you just need to figure out what's best for you. For Caleb. His words stuck with me long after he left. That night, as I lay awake in the guest room, I thought about what Mark had said. For weeks, I'd been trying to hold everything together, to make sense of the chaos Emma's choices had unleashed. But maybe it was time to stop trying. Maybe it was time to let go. The next morning, I told Emma we needed to talk. We sat at the dining table, the same place where I'd opened the DNA results. She looked at me with tired, tear-filled eyes, bracing herself for what I was about to say. "I can't do this anymore," I said, my voice steady but firm. "I can't keep living like this, pretending we can fix something that's so broken. I need to move on, Emma, for my sake and for Caleb's." Her face crumpled, and she reached for my hand, but I pulled away. "Chris, please," she begged. "Don't give up on us. I'll do anything to make this right." "I know you will," I said softly, "but it's not enough. Some things can't be undone, Emma, and this is one of them." The decision to separate was both heartbreaking and freeing. I moved into a small apartment a few miles away, close enough to see Caleb regularly but far enough to give myself the space I needed. Caleb struggled with the transition, his anger and hurt manifesting in ways that broke my heart. But over time, we began to find a new rhythm, a fragile but growing sense of stability. Emma and I stayed civil for Caleb's sake, but our conversations were brief and distant. The love we'd once shared was gone, replaced by the cold reality of what we'd become. Months later, as I sat on the porch of my apartment, watching the sun set over the city, I felt a strange sense of peace. Life wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was moving forward. I was rebuilding, piece by piece, learning to live with the scars Emma's betrayal had left behind. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to hope, not for what had been, but for what could be, a future where the truth didn't weigh me down, where I could find happiness again, even if it was on my own.